So now we go into news rumors. We actually had multiple things happen today, hours, I guess, before we recorded. So the first one, JJ Redick, right? Officially hired by the Lakers, 4-year deal, about $8 million a year. Crazy story to follow. I mean, there were a lot of moments where I think we thought we knew what was going on, but we really didn't. I still don't really understand half of it. I don't know where the heck the Dan Hurley thing came from. It came out of nowhere, and we thought it was going to happen, and then it didn't. And then Shams basically was saying that it was never happening. It was almost like a Hail Mary. Basically said, like, Woj's reporting was trash, which is kind of funny. It's kind of, I guess, like the Kendrick Lamar Drake beef, right, going on right now. So kind of a funny thing. But, early on, we thought it was Redick. It seemed like it was going to be Redick, and then it wasn't, and then it was, and then it wasn't, and then it was. I feel like there's just a lot of people just reporting kind of strange stuff. It's kind of funny because there was one guy who was covering this whole situation of Lakers Daily, and it was this guy, Anthony Irwin, and he was, for most of the time, he was saying that JJ Redick was the guy. And then at different points, there were a lot of people that were literally just clowning him, just dogging him, trashing him. For saying that his report was fraudulent when, like the Hurley stuff came out. And then after the Hurley stuff was done, then it was like Redick's cooled. But he ended up being right. So there are a lot of people that are going to have to apologize to him, for, basically saying that his reporting was fake because he ended up being right. And Shams ended up being right? Because, there were some other people that were kind of saying that, Shams wasn't on his game at that point. But, he earned it this time. But more importantly, focusing on the actual hire, right? Obviously, there's some other stuff going on here, right? They mentioned him having a long call with AD, right? Because, there was an interesting rumor that kind of suggested that some players may not have wanted him on the team. And I think, in terms of guys that would have any serious level of input, I think we could pretty much figure that out, who that might be. But I guess it's also like the factor of like, we know going forward that AD is going to be the focus of the team. So it makes sense to talk to him, obviously, kind of, just see where he's at and let him know, like, hey, you're our guy. This is how I'm going to, build around or, run things through you or whatever. But, obviously, again, just kind of a funny story. But now he's the Lakers head coach, so goes from player, right, to media guy, podcaster to head coach, right? And this is, I think, the part where it gets kind of, intriguing because obviously he doesn't have any prior head coaching experience, and there's not a very good track record for guys that go into the NBA to coach that don't have that have no coaching experience, right? You've already mentioned Steve Kerr, right, who's a success story, but there are also other guys, right, that were not great success stories, right? Like Steve Nash started off fine, then kind of fell off. And there were others as well, right? Like Derek Fisher was one, right? Which, maybe some people have forgotten by this point, but that didn't really work out. Mark Jackson, funny enough, which I didn't even know, actually just went into coaching and didn't have any prior experience. I did not know that, because I was watching or listening to a podcast. It was, the Bill Simmons podcast where he was listing out guys that went into coaching that didn't have a lot of that had no experience. So I did not know that, and there were others as well. A lot of them former players. But that's the concern with this one, right? Because it could work, right? Because we know he's a very knowledgeable guy about the game. Especially in terms of, modern basketball. And Shams' article kind of talked about, his ideas in regards to playing more through AD, especially late in games. Letting LeBron play off the ball more. I feel like I've heard this like 100 times over the last 6-7 years.
Right.
So, we'll see if they actually stick with it. But, again, that, like I said, some positives are he's a bright guy, but at the same time, it's still a lot different than being a head coach. So, again, I'm hopeful that it works out, but there's also not, a very good track record of stuff like this working out. But I also would say the roster to me is a little bit more important, in terms of like, what do they do with that more so than the coach? Not that the coach isn't important. And obviously who the coach is kind of in a way sort of dictates what the roster might kind of look like. Because the GM and the coach in theory would kind of be, like, hey, these are the type of guys I like to coach. Try to get me some of these type of guys. But, we'll have to see how this works out. Just because, again, there's potential for this to work out, but then there's also potential for it to not work out great, and then he gets fired, and then it doesn't really matter. We'll see. But they have a lot of work to do beyond the coaching this season, anyways. But it's funny because initially we thought it was going to be Redick, then we didn't, and now we do. So
Yeah, and it's funny. Some other notable names, like you talked about, Mark Jackson. I
right.
think it was Doc Rivers with the Orlando
Yep.
Magic, Jason Kidd
Mm-hmm.
as well with the Nets, Larry
Yep.
Bird with the Pacers.
Yep.
So there are some success stories, like you said, but there's
Mm-hmm.
also some failures. I think it raises a lot of questions. Specifically, is this more of like a why is this guy a candidate in the first place, right? I think that's kind of like one thing that people are really honing in on, and a lot of people have talked about the LeBron podcast, all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, I mean, it's a good podcast, you should go and watch it, but at the end of the day, does it offer us insight into what type of coach he's going to be? Not at all,
Mm-hmm.
because this is going to be his first time. We don't know what he's going to look like, and that's the danger.
Right.
But that's also kind of like the beauty in it as well, because it could work out, immensely in the Lakers' favor. But yeah, I think they're handling it in the smartest way that they possibly can. Even though you fumbled with Hurley, we already talked about that. In one of our live streams, they're just like, yeah, the Hurley thing was just not it. In terms of lowballing him and stuff like that. But
Mm-hmm.
you do have an opportunity here, I think, to build a roster that can contend. And also, what is this coaching staff going to look like with
Right.
Redick as well? That's another concern I have. It's
Yeah,
like,
and it was reported from Shams, the idea of some of the possible guys, that could be added to that staff. So they named names like Sam Cassell, right, who's obviously an assistant lead, or one. Well, he's not a lead assistant; he's one of the assistants for the Celtics. My guess is that if he leaves to go to LA, he'd be the lead assistant because otherwise, you might as well just stay in Boston. Um, they mentioned Jared Dudley, right, who's another guy who's currently an assistant coach, right, for the Mavs, right. And then after that, there was also Scott Brooks, right? Former Wizards coach, former OKC coach, right? Kind of interesting. I don't know if that's actually what's going to, but that was a name that was put out there. Also, Rondo, right? Rajon Rondo, right? Former Laker, actually, which is kind of funny.
mm-hmm,
Um, so, it's, I don't know, kind of a interesting mix of names. Again, it would it would be nice if there was somebody that had some prior head coaching experience. I know Scott Brooks is one, but I feel like maybe there might be somebody that might be a little bit better. And I'm not even saying he's a horrible coach or anything because I
he
know he
is.
coached OKC, but I don't know. I would also need to see. I would like to see who they put around him because I feel like if you put some guys with more experience around him, that could probably help the transition. Doesn't necessarily mean it'll all work out in year one because that's a very tall task, I think. But it would at least probably make the transition a little bit smoother. Because a couple of those guys, like Rondo has never coached. Obviously, he was a point guard and a good one at that, obviously. But you know, that's not a guy that has prior head coaching experience. Unless you say oh, he actually, did do some coaching with the teams because I know they mentioned that he kind of coached he and LeBron kind of handled the offense for the Laker team during the title year. But, there's still some questions, cuz like you said, what was the process going into this hire, right? Cuz we don't really know what the process was, right? Like we know some names that were mentioned, but it doesn't really sound like it sounded like Redick was the main guy, and there's
Right.
just so many different stories, even other stories about I think it was because we already mentioned it, right, like that some players may not have been in love with the hire. Again, I don't know what's true and what's not, because these are all things that were reported by different people. Even I think one thing that had come out that said Linda Rambis was kind of against the Redick hiring possibly because of lack of experience, but I also like, why does she have really input on who the coach is anyways?
Right.
But I don't know. It almost feels like it kind of highlights just some of the, I don't know, dysfunction in that group. I mean, at least they settled on a coach that I guess they liked, but they did that 2 years ago, and it seemed cool at first, and then it completely went haywire, and now he's gone. And now you kind of almost understand why it's yeah, they've had a hard time kind of maintaining coaches, right? Because they basically had 8 different coaches, in 12 years, right?
Yeah, and it's like I
So
I don't know. It, like you said, it just highlights the dysfunction. they do tend to overcorrect. But I think, with the Ham firing,
Mhm.
he needed to be gone in this case because he lost the
Right.
locker room. My next question for JJ Redick is, can he command a locker room? I have
Right.
no idea.
Yeah.
I'm sure, he's a likable guy. I think, like you said, he has the IQ and all that stuff, but I need to see what he operates like, around a team, when he's
Mhm.
the head of the team, because I don't want this to end up being, he's like LeBron's figurehead. You know what I mean? Where it's like
Sure.
LeBron is kind of operating behind the scenes and JJ's kind of just standing there. Like, that's what I
Mhm.
don't want.
Mhm.
And I don't think that's going to be the case, but I think you do have to kind of dig deep and look at this hire and question it, because it's
Mhm.
like, has a player ever had like a podcast where his, like, his head coach is his co-host? That's wild to me. If I was a
Mhm.
Laker, I would be like, man, what is this? Like, is this a
Mhm.
joke? Because I don't know if
Mhm.
this, I don't know whether to take this hiring seriously or whether or not to laugh at it, if you want me to be honest. Just
Right, because
because I think there's so many factors that we don't
right, we
know.
don't know. And I think it's okay for us to say, I know we're, since we're doing this podcast thing, like, we should have all the answers, but we don't. We don't
Yeah,
have
we
the
don't.
answers to this one. We have no idea. I mean, I think he might be good, but I don't really know. Like,
Right.
that's the tough part where I don't really have a big frame of reference for this, because even the previous names that we mentioned, I mean, again, like most of them didn't work out. And like, some of the ones that did, there were some special circumstances, right? Like again, with Steve Kerr, he played for some great coaches and also was a GM guy, before he became a head coach. It wasn't like he just retired and then became a head coach. Um, Jason Kidd got better, right? But it took him time to get better, right? Like he wasn't considered like a great coach his first few years. He was out of a job for a little bit. He had to go back, he had to go down to being an assistant coach before he could go back up to being a head coach. So, that's the thing where it's like year one, I don't really expect it to be that amazing. But like I said, I think the roster is kind of a little bit more important, as of right now. I just feel like, because like if it's the same roster, but it's just JJ Redick instead of Darvin Ham, it's probably not really going to be that much different.
Exactly.
Maybe they might win more games because they'll, have a better starting five, but like result, it's probably not going to be a whole lot, a whole, it's probably not going to be that much different. We'll see though.
Yeah.
Um, Another quick, just a quick thing. Monty Williams got fired from Detroit, according to Woj, right? So obviously that kind of more so cements Detroit getting an F grade.
Mm-hmm.
I know you mentioned the Celtics all-time great team. Pistons might be an all-time worst team, not the worst team ever, in terms of talent, but just in terms of how this season went. So yeah, we'll see who gets the job. Some people think it's James Borrego, and that Atkinson might be the guy that gets the Cavs job. They're currently gonna interview some assistants, right? I think they mentioned Micah Nori. They also mentioned Sean Sweetney, as well as JB Bickerstaff, right, who was recently fired from Cleveland. So, obviously they're gonna do their due diligence. I know a lot of people were saying, how did the Lakers, not hire a head coach until 6 days before the draft? Well, there's a couple other teams that don't have head coaches either, but the difference is they fired theirs much later, right? The Lakers fired Darvin Ham only a few days after losing in the first round. So that was basically like a month ago. Maybe more than that, I guess, at this point. Whereas, the Cleveland got, Bickerstaff was fired, like a few weeks ago, right? And then obviously Monty Williams was just fired today. So, or if you're watching this yesterday.